and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. We're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started. Welcome back to the Rewind podcast. My name is Rachel. I will be your host today, and with me is Pastor Derek. Welcome back to the podcast.
So welcome to you, Rachel.
I guess thank you.
Now, here's a question I want to ask you.
Sure.
I hate listening to my own voice. Do you like sitting there listening to your own voice on the headset when you do the introduction?
It's not my...
Because that's your voice.
That is my voice. It's not my favorite thing, but I am growing accustomed to it.
Okay.
But I would not ever choose to be like, hey, I'm going to go listen to myself.
You have to like record an audiobook of yourself reading something and then listen to that reading.
No, I don't. Yeah, I even have a hard time listening back on Thursdays when I teach.
Right.
I don't even want to listen to it back because I've already lived it twice.
I totally am empathetic to that reality.
It's uncomfortable.
Yep.
So here we are.
Sorry, I just had to
Hey, friends,
it just popped into my brain. And as Amanda would tell you, things pop in my brain and then they shoot out of my mouth and we go on tangents.
Here we are.
We are.
I don't know if very many people actually like listening to themselves.
I don't think they do. I don't know what it is. It's weird, right? Because I think it's just that it's the whole issue of what your expectation of reality is, and we don't hear ourselves the same way as we actually sound to others, and that messes us up.
It's true. I'll tell this quick story. When I first started doing video announcements here, I didn't want to, but I did it anyways. I had to leave the auditorium when my video would come on the screen because I was so uncomfortable.
Yeah, I believe that. When I'm talking to individuals who are wanting to get better in
My
teaching
name is
and preaching,
Rachel. I will be your
one of the
host
things
today,
that they should do
and with
is
me
watch themselves.
is Pastor Derek.
And it'll be one of the most uncomfortable things that they do, but you'll improve quickly if you watch yourself.
It's true. It's true. I've got that in the back of my head.
Because I know you've taken communication courses and teaching courses. Has that been told to you before? Have you been forced to watch yourself afterwards?
It's they never made us watch it back thing. But it was encouraged. It was not accustomed to it. But I would not ever choose to be like, hey, well, thanks for that warm opener. We are, for those who are listening, we're in week 2 of our new sermon series called God Time Listening Back Through Attributes of God. This week we were talking about God being omnipotent.
Oh, I was going to say. So for those who don't know, Rachel shared before we got started. How did you learn how to say it? Sorry, I just had to.
It was for spelling, but it was omnipotent.
Yeah, so we're just going to wait and see if omnipotent slips out.
I have to think really hard not to say it that way. So it might come out, but that's why. That's how I spell things. So here we are.
I don't think they do. I admit it is. It's weird, right? Because prostate, it's just the whole issue of diet. I understand. I empathize again. Same.
We're all just humans learning to grow. So you were speaking this week on when I first started doing video announcements here. I didn't want to, but I did it anyways.
We already did it.
Omnipotent. Give us a brief overview of your message and key takeaways that you had for us.
So I wanted to look individuals who framework is better through the messages where we three questions. One of the things that what does it mean to say God is omnipotent or omnipotent? It'll be whichever you prefer. Why does that matter? Why does God's omnipotence matter to us? And then I think
I've got that in the back of my head.
It leads to a third question. Communication courses and teaching kind of the last third of my message dealing with, which is if God is omnipotent, why does He do so?
Made us watch it back.
So that was kind of the flow, the framework of the message as I was thinking through it. I may not have, I don't think the question is going to put up on the screen, but that was the thought process. So discussing the fact that God's omnipotence means that God is limitless in his power to live out his unchanging character. So he is limitless in the things that he can do.
Omnipotent.
I was limited by
so for those who don't know, Rachel
those things that would start.
How did you learn how to say it?
Sorry, I just and then there's the reality that if that's true, if God can really do all these things, if he has this much power, then that can be incredibly good news for us because what is impossible with us.
So it might come with where many people actually.
But then I know so many of us find ourselves in a situation where we're asking God to do the impossible. Sometimes we're asking God to do what seems very impossible. I understand. I empathize again.
We're all just, and those are all great learning processes through. So probably true for all of the attributes. First started doing God, if we're gonna like ask those 3 questions.
Well, I think this series is so important because
give us a brief overview of your message.
Think that these type of things, or these theological things, they're just kind of up there. So I wanted to look, but they're the framework by which we should understand and live out our life. Like all of these are intensely practical realities, not just kind of answers to a test or theological questions for theologians to debate. How we think about God, how we understand God will have a huge implication on how we go about living for God in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And how we understand the rest of Scripture as a whole.
For sure.
Yeah. So was there anything that stood out to you during your preparation time of study this week, or anything that you wanted to talk about but didn't have enough time to talk about in this service?
Yeah, I think we could have taken a lot more time to look at the ways that God shows his power. Mm-hmm. I focused it on the whole idea of creation because I just thought I got to a point during the week where when I started to really stop and think about and comprehend what we're talking about there, your mind begins to hurt. Mm-hmm. That's a good place to be. I think whenever we're thinking about God, part of my goal is that every week we'll end up in a spot where our brains begin to hurt, where we're overwhelmed with, this is actually the way we should use this word, with the awesomeness of God, that actually grows awe in us to think about the incredible nature of who God is. Mm-hmm. So, we could have looked at any number of miracles that God performs throughout Scripture and used that framework to explore what those miracles mean in the lives of us now, and what God could do in our situations. But I think I wanted to spend some time on one area and really kind of take us into it. And you always have a limitation on time, but if I had more time, I would have delved more into other stories where God does the incredible and the impossible.
Well, it kind of makes me think of that. I think it's in Luke where he records there are not enough pages.
Yeah,
and
John. It's at the end of John. Yeah.
Not enough pages, not enough books in the world to ever hold the amount of stories of Jesus. Yeah. So kind of in that same sense.
All the pages. There was couldn't hold.
No.
All the stories that were just to be told about Jesus in the time that he was here.
Right.
Right?
So,
let alone the works of God.
Right.
In all time across all creation.
Forever and eternity.
Yeah.
Okay, so that leads me into this first question here. Kind of the same thing. Why did God create the large and vast universe if we won't ever see or know about it in its entirety?
Yeah, well, I think there's an assumption there that may not be true. So the assumption is that we'll never be able to, but I'm going to backtrack this a little bit. I think that when we look at what God has intended for the future, a new heaven and new earth, I don't think that new means totally new in all of its essence. I think it means new in that it's going to be wiped clean of all of the things that are broken. It's going to be returned to its original intended state. And when you think about infinity and you think about the opportunity, I think some of us have a picture of what eternity is going to look like, where we all just sit around and have a praise and worship service, which some of you would really enjoy, and others of us are kind of like, I'm probably just going to have a sanctified heart and enjoy it, but it's hard for me to imagine. I actually don't. I think if you look, what you see is a a return to what God intended in the garden, which is humanity dwelling with God, exploring, using the gifts that he has given us to steward creation and the created order, to examine it, to enjoy it. And I think, again, this is my theologically informed speculation that eternity will involve us having the opportunity to continue to learn and grow and explore all of what God has created. And so eternity is a long time to explore and create. But even now, think about the fact that the picture that I showed you on Sunday, or the picture that I showed here in Cambridge on Sunday, you got to see that and to marvel at God's handiwork in a way that when the psalmist was writing his words, 3,000 plus years ago, he couldn't even have begun to comprehend. And yet God knew that we would get to marvel at his grandeur and goodness at Forward Church in Cambridge in that moment. So I think presuming on what we will or won't get to experience or enjoy is difficult. I think God's created it because he does want to be known and seen. And at various times, I think when the psalmist was writing, you didn't have to go to a dark sky preserve to see the stars.
Right.
The psalmist would go out and he would see the stars in the sky, but then he was just seeing the first layer of the stars. And I'm excited for what that might mean for us in a new heaven and new earth.
Yeah, because if the things that we can see in God's creation now being tainted by sin, with that gone, your mind can't even comprehend.
No.
And I think the wonder of who God is, that leads me especially to be like, okay, God, what else do you have? It made me curious. Yeah. So if you weren't in Cambridge and you're wondering what this picture was, it was called The Pillars of Creation.
You got it. Yeah, so you can look that up.
Just a quick Google search will probably bring up this.
It will. It just put up like space photo Pillars of Creation. It will come up and you'll be able to check it out.
It is wild, but amazing. So God created everything in the universe, this vast span, but this question came in about God creating or allowing evil. So if God is all powerful, then why do we see so much evil in the world?
Yeah. So I'm going to take a stab at what I think is an intellectually honest answer to this, but is emotionally unfulfilling. And then I'll take a stab at trying to connect to our emotions in this as well. So obviously the problem of evil is one that has been talked about, debated for eons by much greater minds than me. We've actually come to a point in philosophy where that's kind of been set aside as a problem, because it's a problem for both sides. And here's what I mean by that. If you're going to use the framework of evil, then you have to start with the framework that there's a standard of what's good.
Right.
So you've already kind of boxed yourself in by saying, how could God allow evil? Because you have admitted there's an objective standard of good. And where does that objective standard of good come? So the way generally that this question is answered is to understand that if God is going to create an opportunity for human beings to actually love him, he has to create the opportunity for them to choose to love him. Love without choice is not love. That's AI, that's robotic realities, right? It's not actually a choice. But in opening the choice to love, in opening the choice to choose God, the other option is also open, that people would reject God. And that sin would then enter into the picture and all that comes. And so the argument that a philosopher would make about why would God allow for the opportunity for evil to enter into the picture is because it was the only way for God to allow for people to actually have a true relationship with him.
Right.
Again, I think that is not all, it's intellectually consistent. I think it's defendable, but I think when you're experiencing the realities of evil, it doesn't necessarily speak to where your heart is at. And oftentimes I find when people are asking these questions, when they ask theoretical, philosophical questions, they're usually asking them because underneath that, there's a heart issue. And that's why I think Christianity has this secondary resource for us, which is, where is God in the midst of the evil that has taken place, right? And that's where we come to where I ended in our message, is that where God is he enters into it.
Yeah.
What we want to know, what God is going to do about evil, not just why, but what are you going to do about it? And the answer is that, well, God's going to enter into it. Jesus is going to incarnate, and he's going to die on the cross and suffer for all of the evil in order to fix the problem of evil once and for all.
Yeah, and there's so much hope in recognizing that. And I think that ties into what you were talking about in the sermon about the necessity of prayer. And you pointed us to Philippians 4.
Yep.
And
which I know you guys are going to be in soon.
We're in it this week.
Yeah.
But we can see God at work in that. And it's not just because we know God is at work in all things, but he's asking us to invite him into these circumstances.
We might not know the why of our specific circumstance, right? And oftentimes we don't. Sometimes we never know the why. Like I've been through things in my life, and many other people have been through much greater things in their life where they still don't have a why for what. Sometimes with a little bit of distance, you can look back and say, oh, I see why God had that happen. Here's how it's directed my life. There's other times where you're just like, I don't know. So when you don't have a why, you need to answer the what. What has God done? Not why has God allowed this to happen, but what has God done? And that's where we can always go back and go to the cross, and we can always look forward if we belong to God and say, and I also know how the story ends. I know what he's going to do. So I may not know in the moment why this has happened, but I know that I have a God who loves me and cares for me and has done something about it, and ultimately is going to take me to a place where he has corrected and fixed everything.
Yeah. But not always the most easy thing to walk through. There is a challenge to that. And we are people who want answers right away.
For sure.
Sometimes we don't get that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change God's character or nature.
Yeah. I'll give you a quote from Tim Keller. I really, I've appreciated this one. It challenged me when I thought about it, because oftentimes in those moments we get really angry with God, right? Tim Keller, I think this was in his book, Reason for God. He says, if you have a God infinite and powerful enough for you to be angry at for allowing evil, then you must at the same time have a God infinite enough to have sufficient reasons for allowing that evil. And we're going to talk about that reality next week when we talk about his omniscience, that if God knows all the things that we don't know, we have to believe that an all-knowing God would have reasons that we can't reason to.
Right. Yeah. And rooted back in that he is a holy God.
Right.
That's why we started there. So that we could build out from all of that.
Yeah, we would never expect that a holy God who is holy in his omnipotence, who is holy in his omniscience, his justice, his mercy, all of these realities that make him, is going to make the same decisions that we would make as unholy and finite people.
Yeah, right. Okay, so some people or speakers turn to an idea of open theism as a way to justify moments where we question why God didn't act in a way we would expect or think that he should have acted. This person's just opening up the question, while they may not believe this, how is the interpretation of the gospel justifiable when the Bible so clearly describes God's omnipotence and righteousness? So, two things. First, explain to the listeners here what open theism is. And then kind of build out on the question asked.
So, open theism is a theological position that says that when we say God is omniscient and we say that God knows everything, he knows everything that is able to be known, but he's not actually able to know what will take place in the future, because when he created people with free will, he limited his ability to know the decisions that those creatures would make. So basically, God doesn't actually know the decisions that you're going to make, that I'm going to make. He can't actually know the future. He can know possibilities. He's kind of like Doctor Strange in Rachel's making a face.
I don't know it.
In the Avengers movie, which one was that? I think it was Endgame. Might have been the one before that, where he sits down and like he looks at all of the possible realities of a way something could go, a choice could go. And so God can only know all of the different possible realities, but he can't actually know the way things are going to go. I would just say, I'd go back to what I said in terms of what God can and can't do.
Yeah.
That God, being all-knowing, can't actually not know things. He can't limit his knowledge. It would, by definition, limit his godness.
Right.
So I reject the idea of open theism. And I think open theism, one of the reasons that we get attracted to it, or that some people are attracted to it, is because we can't conceive of a God who exists outside of time and space either, right? As soon as you can realize that God is not constrained by time in the way that we are, then it makes it not easier to comprehend and understand, but it makes it more reasonable to understand how God can at the same time know all things, be sovereign over all things, and still allow for human will and choice to enter into the picture. Because he doesn't live within the confines. And it's really hard, because it's kind of like if we lived as a cartoon character explaining that there's a third dimension out there. Right? If you're a 2D character, to understand what this third dimension is when you've never experienced it would be pretty difficult.
It would be difficult.
Yeah. So now as 3D people, we can't understand what it would be like as people who are constantly constrained by the realities of time to say, I'll just exist outside of time.
Yeah. It's beyond our...
We can't conceive of it.
Right. Yeah. Even as I try to think about thinking about it, it's just kind of like your mind is just...
No, it's like going, what does it mean to be without a beginning, without an end?
Yeah.
Your brain just starts to hurt.
It does hurt. And then, to think about what eternity is. It's just beyond anything we know.
Right. So the idea is, I think that they're trying to put together pieces in a way that makes God fit inside of a box that we've constructed, that God already blows out that box. He'll never fit in that box.
No. So with that answer, I feel like you've already answered the other side of this question, because they asked, how is this interpretation of the gospel justifiable? But I don't think it is justifiable.
No, I don't think it is.
No.
I would reject the idea that God could in any way limit what he is able to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that just, our God is so big.
Yeah.
And we can't lose sight of that
Right.
And bringing him down into an understandable level almost isn't even helpful to us in any means. So
I said this the first week, Rach, that every week, hopefully our mind is going to be a little bit blown by God as we delve into these, that we're not going to get to this point where we're like, oh, now I understand God and I can explain him fully.
Yep.
What we want to get to is, now I see God a little bit more clearly, and my wonder at him and my worship of him is expanded because I've seen just a little bit more of who he is, and I recognize how worthy of my worship he is, how trustworthy he is, how much I can just place my faith in him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it comes from a place of full surrender to a God who is so great.
Right.
Yeah. So there's another question here, and it kind of, I think, comes from being able to understand God and his nature and his creation of everything. So sometimes we, people feel numb to the idea that God created everything. This is coming from maybe spiritual attacks or the devil and his tactics, or just simply from apathy. What can we do to get out of that numbness to stay aware of it always?
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm not going to try and pinpoint exactly where it comes from, because I think it can come from all of those. And then I think it can come just from the fact that, again, we're created beings trying to understand an infinite God. And sometimes we just kind of shut down. The other thing is we just go through life. I think numbness probably is a good word. We go through life experiencing so many things that we lose the wonder of it. Like one of the reasons, and maybe this is part of the answer, one of the reasons I love being around kids is that they see everything with eyes of wonder, right? They see things for the first time. And I just love that reality. And sometimes we need to see through the eyes of a child and see things with wonder again. For me, one of the things that is helpful is to be out in nature and to stop and really consider what I'm taking in, to consider as I walk through a forest and I look at the variety of different plants and animals that are represented there, to think, wow, what kind of a God would create such a variety for us to enjoy, just because he's creative and he wants us to see it and to enjoy it, right? To look up at like a big tree and think, man, this thing is so tiny in comparison to the God who has created it. To go to a mountain, I love going to the mountains and to stand on top of the mountains, and you're just in awe of the scope. Yeah. And then you realize, wow, this is just like a tiny little picture of just this world, and this world is a tiny little picture in the solar system, and we just keep on building out from there, and your wonder is increased.
Yeah. There's a spiritual pathways. I think that's what the book is called, and it walks you through. So if you're not aware of what your natural tendencies or pathways to feel and experience God, this one has some really great examples of it. I can't help beyond because I'm also nature. So just being in nature, quiet time, getting out, and just giving yourself permission to see the God of creation and experience him changes the way. And then it's like one of those disciplines, as you foster it and experience it, it becomes natural.
Just thinking about, as we're talking here, Rach, the reality is we have to keep on coming back to those things. I think about the disciples who got to see Jesus do so many mind-blowing things where their minds were blown in the moment about what's happening, right? Whether that's Jesus calming the storm or feeding the 5,000, which was actually 15,000 or more. And yet even they, in crucial moments, having experienced all they experienced, they run away when he goes to the cross. Yeah. Even as he has been resurrected and is standing before them about to ascend to heaven, as Pastor Kirk shared the other week, it says they worshiped him, but some doubted. Like, we have to keep on coming back to and have some grace on yourself and have some grace on others when we struggle, because that's part of our humanness.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. But you can still learn to do it.
You can. Yeah. You can discipline yourself.
Start somewhere.
But it doesn't mean that you won't still have moments where you go numb or where you fail to recognize God at work. And that's also why we need others. Sometime to just tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, like, do you realize what God just did in your life? Do you realize how God has just worked in this situation?
And being able to celebrate and share that with one another is so essential. Yeah, because days are dark. Yeah. There are hardships across the board, but I think when we're not postured under that thankfulness or cultivating those moments of gratitude, that's where it becomes harder.
Sometimes God shows up in your story so that you can share your story to bring comfort to somebody else's story when they're in the middle of it. So Apostle Paul says that God is the God of comfort who comforts us in our affliction so that we can comfort others. And sometimes the sharing of your story of how God showed up in a similar way. Again, we have to be careful here and not transfer your story onto their story. Right. But when God opens up the opportunities for you to share how he's been at work, take advantage of those situations of how he's been at work and share that because you never know who's listening and who might say, oh man, that just encourages my heart because I'm in a similar spot today and I know God can show up.
Yeah. And because he is all powerful, he can work in so many ways. A question here coming from being steadfast in prayer. It's a pretty clear indication. Be steadfast in prayer. Pray continually. But what does it mean to be watchful for it? This coming out of Colossians 4:7, perhaps what Daryl spoke about, because I don't remember. But Colossians 4:7 talks about being steadfast and watchful in prayer. What does that mean, and how does that tie us into God's power?
Yeah, well, I think part of being watchful is like being aware where God is at work. And at least in my prayer life, it's easy for me to come to God with the things that I want him to fix and come to him with my list. And I tend to lose a little bit of watchfulness about, but then he showed up and did something, and to stop and have a thankful heart. I think it ties into what we're frequently commanded to, is to pray with thanksgiving. That we should, if our prayer life is simply focused around the list that we want to, if it's a to-do list for God all the time, and there's no recognition of the things that God has done list, it's going to shape us in ways, and it's going to shape our prayer life in ways that aren't helpful.
Yeah. And not even just, it will not only just shape our prayer lives, but it will shape how we act and react to other situations. Because then again, it's putting God in that box. Well, we're giving you this list of things we want you to do. It's not turning out the way I wanted it. What does that say about God?
I totally agree. I think so often when you look at Psalms, you'll see the recounting of God's salvific work amongst his people, right? And they're doing it, Psalms are songs and Psalms are prayers. It's people calling out to God. And so often it is, God doesn't need to be reminded of what he did.
Right.
But his people need to be reminded of what he did, because God is, as we're going to get into, I think our very last attribute of God on New Year's Eve is God is immutable. God doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if we can remind ourselves of what God has done in the past, we can remind ourselves that is the same God who saved then can save now.
And that's going to be such a wonderful, timely reminder at the end of the year.
Yep.
But it's not going to cover all the attributes of God. It's just the ones that we've decided to go with.
Where we don't have. I could definitely see us coming back to God is part 2 at some point.
That's right. Okay, so when we talk about being prayerful and surrendering and cultivating this kind of life as a disciple, what does total surrender to God's omnipotence look like? And does it look like an anxiety-free life, or what does it look like?
I think we have to be careful of how we use that word anxiety. I think we throw around words like anxiety, and we have to understand there's a difference between sometimes clinical anxiety and then being anxious. So when God tells us to not be anxious about everything or anything, that is a call to not be in a state where we're constantly choosing to worry about things, but instead by everything by prayer and supplication, make our requests known before God
with thanksgiving.
So I want to separate those two things. I want to separate clinical anxiety from just an anxious heart, a heart where I'm constantly worrying, stressing. Worry, stress, anxiety are usually reflective of us trying to do a job we're not equipped for. We're trying to manufacture a sense of control that we don't really have. And it doesn't make a lot of sense when we stop and think about it. What makes a lot more sense is to give it over to the person who has control. Now, that giving over generally is not just a one-time thing.
No, it's not.
So it's every time that thing comes into your heart where you begin to stress and strain and worry. And again, it doesn't mean not doing the things that you're capable and able to do. Sometimes you're worrying and stressing about things because you haven't done what you need to do in a situation, right? So it's when I've done what I can do, when I've done the things that God has asked me to do, I take those cares, those concerns that I know that I can't do anything about, and I give it over to the one who can. And I trust not only that he is able, but that he is good. And that however he answers this, I can trust that he is doing it for my good and for his glory. The only way that you can grow in that is by growing in an understanding of who he is. The only way that you can grow in that is by practicing it and seeing him prove himself trustworthy and growing in faith because of the way that he proves himself trustworthy.
Yeah. Yeah. And then cultivating that kind of idea, and small steps at a time. It's one step in front.
Now, Rach, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is like you've had to walk this journey a little bit in terms of like
everything.
Well, but how do you take your worries and your anxieties to him, right?
Yeah. I would have said that I was a very anxious person most of my life. I was worried about something or another.
Yep.
Most things outside of my control, but it was just part of who I was.
Right.
And so it has been a long journey of processing through that. So I think I've shared very openly about my fear of public speaking and walking into leadership in the church and just in general. But it was kind of one of those things that I literally just had to pray for. Invite people into, and just kind of take those next steps. Okay, God, when I really chose to live a fully surrendered life, and said, okay, God, like, I'm giving it to you. What do you want me to do? It was kind of one of those things where it was like, okay, start here.
Right.
And it was one step where he just led me into one direction. So that for me looked like, well, all the way back was me praying with my my life group at the time, or discipleship group now. But being
way to go! You don't have to put any money in the jar.
Yes. Being open to praying in that group of people.
Yeah.
And it started there, and then it was like, okay, now I'm asking you to join the announcement team, which I didn't want to do, but I said, okay, God, I'll do that. And he was faithful in walking alongside me in this small, and it's just been growing ever since. And so it's been an ability just to be like, okay, God, now you've called me to write a Bible study to lead the women.
Yeah.
And you've been faithful all these years before. So I'm trusting that in the very least, I'm going to learn to trust you even more as I write this. And so for me, it was being obedient into what he was calling to next. I didn't know what it was going to look like, but it was just saying, okay, God, and okay, God. And so I can see these moments where he's been faithful all the way through, which really helps me to say, okay, I can do that because I know that you have been with me and you've been leading, and I'm seeking to follow after the will you've put on my life. So I'm going to take that next step.
Yeah.
It's not always easy by any means. There is a lot of internal wrestling and sweating and lot.
And there's times where we fall down in it, right? And then God's grace is sufficient for us. He doesn't sit there and say, oh man, you're back to worrying and back to being anxious.
Yep.
He invites us to kind of repent of that, and repent of that means not just apology, but now I'm going to get back on track with trusting you in this.
Yeah. So it's not easy.
Yeah.
But it has shifted because now I'm not living marked with anxiety, stress, and worry, knowing that God is fully in control, and good or bad, I'm being obedient, and that's all he's called me to do.
Yeah. And where God's omnipotence fits back into this is when we struggle to not do this. Mm-hmm. I think it's generally in one of a few areas. So sometimes we struggle to surrender and turn things over to him and trust him and give our anxieties and worries over to him because we're not totally sure that he's good. Mm-hmm. Like, can we really trust that God has our best interests at heart, that he's going to care for us and take care of us in this? Mm-hmm. Sometimes we may believe that he's good, but we struggle to believe that he's able to do what we're asking of him. That's where God's omnipotence comes in, right? It's a growing in our belief, in our faith that God is able to do what I am unable to do. Yeah. And then what we're going to see this next week, I'll give you a little spoiler again, is that sometimes we struggle to give those things over to him because we're convinced that our plan is better than his plan.
Yes, and he will shift that drastically because I'll add on to it. God's plan for me was not even remotely close to my plan for myself.
Right.
So I can echo
that reality very much so. But we struggle to have faith in his omniscience, that he could have a better plan for us than the plan that we've drawn up, that we would like him to follow. No, God, I believe that you're good. I believe that you're powerful. And if you're good and you're powerful, you'll do my plan. Which is what I explained on Sunday as well, that like sometimes we wonder why God isn't doing anything, but the reality is he's not doing our thing.
And we haven't seen the whole picture yet. And I think that's the hard part, is waiting for the full picture of finished, complete.
Because we're like, if I was omnipotent, if I had God's power to do something in my life, this is what I would do for me.
Right now.
Right now. And I was talking to somebody this week and I said, like, we know this, if you've got kids, if you've been around kids, you know the reality that there's a reason you don't let kids make decisions about things. Because if you gave them the power that an adult has to make decisions, they'd make different decisions for you, but they wouldn't be the decisions that are best for them. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the wisdom to make the right decision if they had the power that you had as an adult.
And sometimes we get that freedom though to do what we want.
We do.
And God says, okay.
The same way that we do that sometimes as parents, right? Like some of you, we're recording, it's Halloween today. Like I know some of you, your kids will want to dig into candy and you'll give up fighting the fight and you just say, fine, eat as much candy as you want, because they'll gorge themselves on candy and get sick and not want to touch the rest of it for a while.
Just as long as we don't have to clean up the mess. Any last words or thoughts, encouragement that you want to leave everyone with today about God as omnipotent?
I would just want people to know, whatever you're facing today, if you're a follower of Jesus, the thing that you are facing may be overwhelming, maybe way too big for you to handle. It's not too big for God to handle. It's not even close to causing him stress or distress. The things that would worry us when we start to think about the power that God has, it seems laughable that he would worry about it, right? And he's not going to worry about it, but he is worried about you. He does care about you. So you can trust him in that. And when you're in the midst of not being able to understand the moment, it's good to be able to frame your journey between where you've been and where you're going. I think of this in terms of like, sometimes we find ourselves in a fog in our life. But the good thing here is that we can look back and kind of have a fixed position of, okay, I know what God has done. He's been good to me. He loves me. He's called me from death to life. He's called me out of darkness into glorious light through Jesus Christ. That is true for me. And I know no matter how foggy the road is in front of me right now, how difficult it is, whatever obstacles may lay in my way, I know where the road ends, that I'm going to get to that destination because Christ is going to see me through. And there is a eternity laid out for me that Christ has purchased for me that is going to make all of these difficulties and struggles and sufferings that are so big and so real right now, that are sometimes so painful, but all of them are going to pale into what I will experience when I spend eternity with my God forever in new heaven and new earth. And just reframing your moment, because the moment can seem so big, the obstacle can seem so big, the difficulty can seem so big. It's not so big and so difficult for God, and God has got this.
And on those lines, even in those moments where you feel foggy and dark, inviting God or asking God to remind you, like a simple prayer of, God, I just need to feel you or sense you today. God can handle both prayers, so he can show you who he is while you're still waiting for answers.
And we said, be watchful in prayer. Be watchful for how he answers that. And don't dictate to him how he needs to answer that.
No.
Just be watchful for the moments, for the person who comes alongside you and speaks a word of encouragement into your life today, for the little acts of goodness that he shows to remind you, hey, I'm still here. I still care.
I still love you. And it could be a person, or it could be a sunrise, or it could be a bird in the sky. But have eyes to see God's handiwork at work.
Yeah.
And you're not in it alone.
You're not in alone.
We have people. There's people all around you. There's people here at the office who would love to walk alongside, to pray with you, to hold you up, to walk alongside as you walk through the difficult, foggy moments, or even celebrate in the really good moments. I think we all want to just be there for those people. So that's the invitation that I always love to share. Reach out if you need it. There are people who will pray with you or just give a word of encouragement. So hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about who God is. Continue to follow along with us as we go through the rest of this series, and we'll see you back next week. Bye for now.